Everyone knows Fawlty Towers had only 12 episodes, but almost no one knows why. The official story is about perfectionism, about stopping at the peak. Yeah, about that. The truth is much darker. A single scene in a single episode sparked a massive backlash. It created so much pressure behind the scenes that it became impossible to continue. This wasn't just a creative choice, it was damage control. We're breaking down the one scene that completely finished Fawlty Towers. The curse of being the best. So here's the deal. Before we get to the one scene that burned the whole thing down, you have to understand what Fawlty Towers is. We're not just talking about some old, dusty sitcom. We are talking about a show that is basically a religion. In the year 2000, the British Film Institute, a group of the smartest TV people on the planet, voted Fawlty Towers the #1 greatest British television show of all time, not the greatest comedy. The greatest show, period. And they did it with just 12 episodes. Think about that. Friends made 236 episodes, The Office made 201, Seinfeld made 180, Fawlty Towers did 12. That's it. 6 in 1975 and 6 more 4 years later in 1979. Then it vanished, forever. The official story, the one everyone repeats, is about perfection. John Cleese, the star and co-writer, famously said he wanted to stop before the quality dropped. He said he'd rather have a fine restaurant that is always full than a chain of mediocre restaurants. It's a great line. It sounds smart. It sounds noble. But here's the catch. It's not the whole story. It's not even close. The truth is, Fawlty Towers wasn't just a TV show. It was a pressure cooker. It was a machine built by two geniuses who were also, at the time, destroying their own lives. The show's co-creator was Connie Booth, Cleese's wife. She also played Polly, the sensible maid who always had to clean up Basil's messes. What most people don't realize is the insane level of work they put in. These scripts weren't written in a weekend. Cleese and Booth spent 6 weeks writing every single script. That's over 40 days for 30 minutes of TV. They would plot the entire thing on a huge sheet of paper, mapping every character's entrance, every exit, every misunderstanding, every single prop. A kipper, a moose head, a garden gnome, every piece had to fit together like a Swiss watch. If one piece was wrong, the whole 30-minute explosion wouldn't work. This was a new kind of comedy. It wasn't the happy, gentle stuff people were used to. This show was mean. It was about anger. It was about failure. It was about deep, soul-crushing frustration. And it was about a terrible marriage. Basil Fawlty wasn't a lovable goof. He was a monster. He was a snob. He was cheap. He was rude. And he was trapped in a personal prison, mostly by his terrifying wife, Sybil. The crazy part is, the BBC didn't even get it. When the head of comedy read the first script, he sent a memo that said, and this is a real quote, "I am unable to see the humor in this." He called it a collection of cliches and stock characters which I can't see being anything but a disaster. They hated it. They thought the plots were too complicated. But Cleese was a megastar from Monty Python, so they nervously let him do it. The first season aired. It wasn't an instant smash. But audiences, they saw something amazing. They saw real, raw human frustration turned into high art. The show became a massive hit. Naturally, the BBC wanted more. And more. And more. But it took 4 years to get a second season. 4. Why? Because the pressure was already too much, and the partnership at the heart of the show was already dead. The perfectionism wasn't just a choice, it was a symptom of something much, much darker, a darkness that had been there from the very beginning. This show wasn't just about a disaster, it was born from one. A vacation from hell. Yeah, about that, Basil Fawlty wasn't just a character, he wasn't just made up, he was real. And the story of where he came from is the first wild theory that explains why this show was always destined to explode. Some people say the show was cursed from the start, born from a place of pure, unfiltered rage. It all starts in 1970. The Monty Python crew was on location in a seaside town called Torquay. They needed a place to stay. They booked into a local place called the Glen Eagles Hotel. And that's when they met the owner, Donald Sinclair. Sinclair was not just a bit rude. He was a creature from another dimension. He was so completely, unbelievably awful that the Python team thought they were being filmed for a prank show. This man hated his guests. He seemed to hate his job, his hotel, and just people in general. He was a snob of the highest order, convinced he was running a high-class establishment, when in reality it was just a normal seaside hotel. The stories from that one stay are legendary. Michael Palin, one of the Python members, kept a detailed diary. He wrote that Sinclair was the most wonderfully rude man I've ever met. But rude is putting it lightly. Get this, Terry Gilliam, the American member of the group, was eating dinner. He used his fork and knife in the American way, you know, cutting with one, then switching. Sinclair saw this. He marched over to the table, grabbed the cutlery out of Gilliam's hand, and told him, "We don't do that here." He was correcting a paying guest's table manners. But that's not even the wow factor. The real story, the one that defines this man, involves Eric Idle's briefcase. Idle left his briefcase near the reception desk. Sinclair found it. Did he call Idle's room? No. Did he put it in Lost and Found? No. Sinclair's paranoid brain decided it was a bomb. So he grabbed the briefcase, walked outside, and threw it over a garden wall. Some versions of the story say he threw it off a cliff into the sea. Either way, he took a guest's personal property and launched it into the void, because he was a paranoid maniac. The Monty Python team was horrified. They packed their bags and left the very next morning. They found a new hotel. They couldn't stand one more second of Donald Sinclair. But John Cleese and Connie Booth stayed behind. Cleese was fascinated. He didn't see a bad hotel manager. He saw comedy gold. He saw the perfect character, a man totally at war with his own life. He and Booth stayed for weeks, studying Sinclair. They took notes, they watched him berate guests, throw timetables at people, and generally have meltdowns. This is where the show was born. It was born from this real-life vortex of anger and dysfunction. Even Sinclair's wife, who apparently actually ran the hotel while he was busy being a monster, became the direct inspiration for Sybil. So here's the theory. The show wasn't just based on this. It was infected by it. Cleese took all that negative energy, all that rage and frustration, and used it as fuel. He and Booth built their perfect 12-episode machine, but they built it on a foundation of pure chaos, and that chaos would eventually and inevitably consume them when the laughter stopped being fun. So Cleese and Booth take this real-life nightmare and spin it into gold. Season 1 in 1975 is a masterpiece. It's built on that Sinclair energy, but it's also built on their energy. The chemistry between Cleese, the uptight giant, and Booth, the calm, clever sinner, was the show's secret weapon. They were married, they were in love, and they were a brilliant writing team. But that's putting it lightly. The pressure of Fawlty Towers was immediate. Remember, 6 weeks per script. They would act out every scene in their living room, arguing over every single word. The show was their life, there was no separation. And the show's very topic, a miserable, trapped, bickering couple, started to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. They were writing about a marriage falling apart while their own marriage was falling apart. The stress was unbelievable. After season 1, the BBC was begging for more. They would have greenlit 50 episodes. But Cleese and Booth said, no, they were done. They were exhausted. The show had taken everything from them. It took 4 years for them to come back. 4 years. And what happened in those 4 years? Their marriage completely dissolved. This is the central painful secret of Fawlty Towers. John Cleese and Connie Booth got divorced in 1978, and it was after their divorce that they agreed to come back and write season 2. Let that sink in. Imagine the pain of that. You've just gone through a heartbreaking separation. You are trying to build a new life, and then you agree to go back to work in a room with your ex-spouse to write a comedy about a miserable marriage. It's one of the most bizarre and torturous creative decisions in TV history. Friends who were around them at the time said the process was awful and excruciating. They weren't just writing partners anymore. They were two people who had failed as a couple, forcing themselves to relive that failure every single day just to hit a deadline. The pressure was no longer just high. It was unbearable. They had to make this second season perfect. It had to be better than season 1. It had to be worth the personal, emotional cost they were paying every single day. They were pouring every last drop of their creative energy and their emotional wreckage into these final 6 scripts. They were building the perfect bomb. They wrote 6 episodes, and the very last one they wrote, the final episode of the entire series, was an episode called The Germans. They had no idea they thought they were writing the climax of their masterpiece. What they were actually writing was the show's obituary. The match was about to hit the gasoline. The concussion that changed TV. This is it, the moment. The one scene that the whole show and the careers of its creators would pivot on Season 2, Episode 6. The final episode ever made. The Germans. The plot itself is a masterclass in farce. It's pure, escalating chaos. It starts with a fire drill that goes completely wrong. Then Basil tries to hang a moose head on the wall, and it falls on him. He gets a concussion. Then, in the middle of all this, a group of German guests checks in. Basil, who is now dizzy, confused, and barely able to stand from his head injury, becomes obsessed with one simple rule. He tells his staff, especially Polly, Connie Booth, don't mention the war. It's a simple instruction. But Basil, being Basil, is physically incapable of following his own rule. He is so desperate not to offend the German guests that he can't stop talking about his country's history with them. The entire dinner service is one of the most painful, awkward, and hysterically funny scenes ever filmed. Basil is in a full-on meltdown. He's mixing up words. He's asking them if they're from Germany. He's trying to explain the difference between herring and hearing, and it just comes out as a jumble of aggressive nonsense. The German guests are just trying to have a quiet dinner. They are polite, they are confused, and Basil is just losing it in front of them. And then it happens. The one scene. Basil is trying to take their order. His concussion-addled brain is firing on all the wrong cylinders. He's mixing up prawns and krauts. He's getting more and more frantic. Finally, one of the German guests, who is starting to get upset, asks him to stop. Basil snaps. He says, "You're starting, aren't you? You're invading." And then he does it. He puts his finger under his nose like a mustache. He sticks his other arm out in a stiff salute, and he begins to goose-step around the dining room, doing a full-on, over-the-top screaming imitation of Adolf Hitler. It lasts maybe 5 seconds, but it was nuclear. In 1979 on the BBC, this was unthinkable. This wasn't a subtle joke. This was the main character of the most popular show in Britain on primetime, imitating one of the most evil figures in modern history. For a laugh. The German guests are horrified. One of them breaks down in tears. Sybil, Basil's wife, is mortified. And Basil, in his concussed haze, just thinks he's being funny. Now here's the deal. As a piece of writing, the joke is on Basil. The scene is not making fun of the German guests. It's making fun of Basil. It's a joke about how stupid, ignorant, and obsessed some British people still were about the war 34 years after it ended. It's a joke about ignorance. But that is not how everyone saw it. The second that episode aired, the complaints didn't just roll in, they flooded the BBC. The network was under siege, and this wasn't just a few angry people, this was a firestorm. The public was completely split. Half the audience thought it was the most brilliant, daring, and hilarious thing they had ever seen. The other half was appalled. They called it tasteless. They called it offensive. They said the BBC had gone way, way too far. And the BBC bosses? They didn't laugh. They panicked. They were getting slammed from all sides. Critics were furious. Viewers were furious. What most people don't realize is how close the BBC came to banning the episode entirely. They seriously considered pulling it from the air and never ever showing it again. For John Cleese and Connie Booth, divorced, exhausted, and emotionally shattered from the process, this was the absolute last straw. The masterpiece they had bled for was now being called offensive trash. The fallout was just beginning. The price of a single joke. So here's the deal. The Germans episode airs. The public is at war with itself. The network is hiding under its desk. And John Cleese and Connie Booth are standing in the middle of the wreckage, having just completed what they knew was their life's best work. But the backlash was so much worse than they expected. And it wasn't just about the goose-stepping. The episode also had another, even more sensitive landmine. The character of the Major, an old, senile, permanent resident of the hotel, has a scene where he tells a story. And in that story, he uses several extremely offensive and outdated words to describe different groups of people. At the time, the joke was, again, on the Major. It was to show that he was an ancient, out-of-touch, bigoted old fool. The audience is supposed to laugh at his ignorance, but combined with the Hitler imitation, the entire episode felt toxic to the network. The BBC, in a full-on panic, did something that would haunt Cleese for decades. They censored his work. Without his permission, they went into the master tapes and cut out the Major's offensive lines. For years, the version of the Germans that was shown in repeats was a butchered version. They wanted to sanitize it. They wanted to make the problem go away. For John Cleese, this was the ultimate betrayal. It was worse than a bad review. It was the network he worked for, the BBC, calling him a bigot and changing his art. The point of the comedy was to be dangerous. The point was to show these characters, warts and all, Basil was a monster. The Major was a dinosaur. Taking that away didn't just soften the show, it ruined the joke, and this fight never ever ended. As late as 2013, broadcasters were still cutting that scene. In 2020, a streaming service called UKTV pulled the entire episode off its platform. They said it contained offensive content and didn't meet audience expectations in the modern era. Cleese, now in his 80s, was livid. He went on the warpath. He called the decision stupid, cowardly, and spineless. He had to fight again 40 years later to explain his art. He said, if you can't see that, if you think that the Major is being lauded, then you are stupid. Now imagine dealing with that. But it's 1979, you are exhausted, you are divorced from your writing partner, you have just survived the emotional trauma of writing season 2, and your reward? A public outcry, and a network that is actively chopping up your work because they're afraid of it. This right here is the real reason the show ended. The perfection story is a cover. The truth is that the controversy from the Germans made a third season psychologically impossible. Why would they ever come back? Why would Cleese and Booth put themselves through that emotional hell again just to have their work censored and be called offensive by the public? The joy was gone. The fight to create was replaced by a fight to defend. They had hit their absolute peak with the Germans, but that peak was a volcano. And when it erupted, it burned the entire creative partnership to the ground. Cleese and Booth would never write together again. Fawlty Towers was over. But the story gets even darker, because for one of them, it wasn't just the show that ended. It was everything. Why Connie Booth quit forever. This is the wildest and maybe the saddest theory of all. The one scene in The Germans didn't just end Fawlty Towers. It ended the entire career of its co-creator, Connie Booth. Think about it. John Cleese was already a superstar. He was Monty Python. He was bulletproof. When the backlash for The Germans hit, he could take it. He was a fighter. He was used to controversy. He went on to become one of the biggest movie stars in the world with a fish called Wanda and Shrek. He became a legend. But what about Connie Booth? Connie Booth was the quiet genius behind the legend. She was Polly. She was the calm center of the storm. She was, by all accounts, just as responsible for the show's brilliance as Cleese was. She co-wrote every single word. She was in the trenches with him for 6 weeks. For every script, she was not a loud, aggressive performer. She was a thoughtful, brilliant writer. And she was the one who had just had her heart broken by the divorce. Now picture this. You're Connie Booth. You've just survived the appalling process of writing season 2 with your ex-husband. You pour your soul into this final batch of episodes. It's the best work you will ever do. And the second it airs, the public in your own network turns on you. They call your work offensive, tasteless, bigoted. They censor it. They chop it to pieces. For Cleese, it was a fight. For Booth, it was devastating. The divorce was a personal failure. This was a public one. She saw the true, ugly face of fame. She saw that no matter how perfect your art is, people can and will tear it apart. So what did Connie Booth do after Fawlty Towers? She vanished. No, seriously, She starred in a few more small things, and then in the mid-1990s, she completely and totally retired from public life. She didn't just stop acting, she fled. Get this, Connie Booth went back to school. She studied for 5 years at the University of London, and then she became a psychotherapist. A psychotherapist. She went from being one of the most famous comedy writers in the world to quietly listening to other people's problems. She has been a therapist in London for over 20 years. She never gives interviews. She never talks about Fawlty Towers. She has never participated in any of the reunions or documentaries. She is, for all intents and purposes, gone. The wild theory is that the trauma of the Germans is what did it. The 1-2 punch of a painful divorce, followed by the public rejection and censorship of her greatest work, was so profound that it made her quit the entire industry. That one scene, that goose step, didn't just end a TV show. It ended a brilliant career. It drove one of the greatest comedy minds of a generation into permanent hiding. The show wasn't just over. It was broken. The unlikely reboot. So here's the deal. We've been asking for 50 years, why there are only 12 episodes of Fawlty Towers. It's the ultimate question in comedy. This isn't just a show, it's a monument. It's a perfect 12-sided diamond of sitcom writing, and for decades, the easy answer, the one that makes everyone feel good, is perfectionism. We're told they quit while they were ahead, that they simply achieved perfection, and like savvy artists, knew not to touch the canvas again. It's neat. It's tidy, and it protects the legacy. But that's a lie. It's a cover story. The truth is that Fawlty Towers was never a sustainable project. It was a machine built to self-destruct. It was a pressure cooker from day one, and the only possible outcome was an explosion. The miracle isn't that it ended so soon. The miracle is that it ever got made at all. You have to look at the DNA of the show. It wasn't built on jokes. It was built on pain. One, it was born from the curse of a real-life, angry, dysfunctional hotel manager. It was fueled by rage. When the Monty Python team stayed at the Gleneagles Hotel in Torquay, they met the owner, Donald Sinclair. This wasn't just a quirky guy. This was a man who hid Eric Idle's briefcase behind a wall thinking it was a bomb. This was a man who threw a bus timetable at a guest who dared to ask when the next bus arrived. John Cleese was obsessed. He saw this man as the perfect encapsulation of British rage and frustration. The show wasn't an invention, it was a documentary. It was an attempt to process the trauma of meeting a truly miserable human being. That's the foundation. 2. It was written by a married couple whose relationship was dissolving as they wrote it. John Cleese and Connie Booth weren't just writing a sitcom. They were performing an autopsy on their own marriage in real time for a national audience. Imagine the psychological toll. Every single argument Basil had with Sybil, every moment of misunderstanding, every ounce of resentment and trapped misery wasn't just a joke. It was real. They were channeling their real-life frustrations directly into the script, using fiction to say the things they couldn't say to each other over breakfast. The show became a battleground for their dying relationship. 3. The pressure to be perfect drove them to an emotional and creative breaking point. This part of the myth is true, but not in the way we think. It wasn't gentle perfectionism. It was a grueling, soul-crushing obsession. Cleese and Booth would spend weeks, sometimes months, on a single 30-minute script. They would lock themselves away, agonizing over every single word, every plot point, every door slam. This wasn't a happy-go-lucky writer's room, it was a creative war zone. By the time they finished the second series, they were divorced, they were exhausted, and they had nothing left to give. The well was dry. The pressure cooker was screaming. The marriage was dead. The creative energy was gone. All it needed was one final push to blow the whole thing apart. And that's when they aired The Germans. You know the scene. Basil, having suffered a concussion, is trying to manage a group of German guests. "Don't mention the war," he whispers before launching into the most infamous goose step in television history. That one scene, Basil Fawlty's goose step, was the spark that lit the fuse. The massive public backlash and the censorship from the BBC was the final explosion. The BBC, in a panic, initially tried to cut the scene. They fought Cleese on it. The press was brutal. The very thing that made the show brilliant, its willingness to go to the most uncomfortable places, was suddenly its greatest liability. It proved to Cleese and Booth beyond a shadow of a doubt that the personal, emotional hell they put themselves through was not worth it. The fight to create had been replaced by a fight to defend, and they were too tired to fight anymore. The controversy from the Germans is what really ended Fawlty Towers. It shattered the already broken partnership of its creators. It drove Connie Booth out of the business forever. She was done. She retreated from the spotlight, traumatized by the experience, and went on to become a psychotherapist, a career literally dedicated to processing the kind of trauma the show had inflicted on her. It was the perfect tragic end to a perfect tragic show. Are we missing a key detail? Is this all just a theory? The thing is, all of these things happened at the exact same time. It wasn't just the divorce. It wasn't just the burnout. It wasn't just the scene. It was all of it. But that one scene was the catalyst. It was the moment the whole thing became not fun anymore. And the craziest part? The ghost of that controversy still haunts John Cleese. Fast forward, decades pass. The show is a legend. And then in 2023, John Cleese, at 83 years old, announced he was bringing Fawlty Towers back a reboot. So what do you think? Was The Germans a work of comedy genius, or was it just plain offensive? And is the new reboot a terrible mistake? Let us know below. Don't forget to like and subscribe.